In the dusty heart of Texas, 1875, a father's greed would forever change two lives. Sarah Mitchell stood trembling on the auction block, her youth and innocence up for sale to the highest bidder. At just 18, she had known nothing but cruelty from the man who should have protected her. But fate had other plans. Among the crowd of weathered faces and cold eyes stood James Crawford, the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties. Known for his stoic demeanor and fair dealings, he had never intended to bid that day, yet something in Sarah's terrified eyes stirred his soul. What happened next would become legend in those parts, a tale of redemption, courage, and unexpected love. Could a marriage born of mercy transform into something deeper? Could 2 broken souls find healing in each other's arms? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell's fingers traced the delicate engravings on her mother's silver locket, the last remnant of a life that seemed to belong to someone else now. Inside, a faded daguerreotype showed her mother's gentle smile, frozen in time before. Illness had stolen her away 3 winters ago. The inscription read simply, "My dearest Elizabeth, forever yours." Life on the Mitchell farm had once been different. Sarah remembered summer evenings when her mother would sit on the front porch, her voice carrying across the wheat fields as she sang hymns while mending clothes. Her father would return from working the land, his face weathered but kind, pressing a kiss to her mother's cheek before ruffling Sarah's hair. Those memories felt like dried flowers now, fragile, colorless things that crumbled at the slightest touch. Elizabeth Mitchell's death had broken something in Thomas Mitchell that whiskey couldn't fix. The farm's abundant wheat fields gradually withered under his neglect, much like his daughter's spirit beneath his growing cruelty. Each failed harvest drove him deeper into the bottle, and each empty bottle fueled his rage. Sarah learned to move like a shadow through her own home, to gauge his moods by the heaviness of his footsteps, to make herself invisible when the darkness clouded his eyes. She took over her mother's duties, cooking, cleaning, mending, trying to hold together the fraying edges of their life with increasingly desperate determination. The local mercantile stopped extending credit after 6 months of unpaid bills. The church ladies who had brought casseroles and sympathy after Elizabeth's passing now crossed the street when they saw Sarah coming, their whispered conversations falling silent at her approach. She heard the rumors about her father's gambling, about the mounting debts, about the men who came calling at odd hours with hard voices and harder eyes. At night, Sarah would sometimes climb to the hayloft, her mother's locket clutched to her chest, and watch the stars through gaps in the roof. She'd remember her mother's words, "The good Lord never gives us more than we can bear, sweet girl." But lately, Sarah wondered if perhaps he had overestimated her strength. The morning she found the auction notice on her father's desk, the paper still warm from the printer's press, something inside her went very quiet. The words, "Sale of one." Young woman of marriageable age swam before her eyes, the neat black letters as final as grave markers. Her father had stumbled in, reeking of cheap whiskey, and told her it was the only way, his last chance to settle his debts before the men. He came to collect in other ways. "You'll fetch a fine price," he'd slurred, reaching for her face with unsteady fingers. "Pretty thing like you might even end up with some rich rancher, eh? Better than staying here with a worthless old man." Sarah had backed away, her mother's locket burning against her skin like an accusation. In that moment, she understood that the father she had known died alongside her mother 3 years ago. This stranger wearing his face was capable of anything. The Mitchell farm's deed hung crooked on the study wall, its once pristine parchment now yellow and dog-eared, bearing the red stamps of multiple mortgages like wounds across its face. Sarah stood before it, dusting around the frame as she did every morning, though she'd long since memorized every desperate amendment and borrowed sum scrawled in her father's increasingly unsteady hand. 300 acres of prime Texas soil. That's what her grandfather had left them. Mitchell land, he'd called it, where a man can grow anything if he's got the grit. The farm had flourished under her father's care, back when he still had pride in his name and soil beneath his fingernails instead of cards and dice. Now the ee-yee. Wheat fields lay fallow, stretching toward the horizon like a broken promise. The fence posts sagged, the barn roof leaked, and the windmill creaked a mournful song day and night. Sarah had tried to maintain what she could, but some tasks required a man's strength, or at least a man who still cared enough to provide it. She paused in her dusting to study the latest addition to the deed, $1,000 borrowed from Edwin Blake, the ruthless owner of the local saloon. Her father had stumbled home that night, proudly waving the money as if it were salvation instead of another nail in their coffin. "This'll turn it all around, girl," he'd declared. By morning, the money was gone, lost to cards and cheap whiskey. The farm's decline mirrored her father's. Where he had once risen before dawn to check the fields, he now slept until noon, nursing hangovers in the darkened study. The strong hands that had once guided a plough now shook too badly to hold anything smaller than a bottle. The sharp mind that had calculated crop yields and market prices now struggled to remember what day it was. Sarah's world had shrunk to the space between the kitchen and the study, where she left bland stews that often went uneaten and changed out whiskey bottles that emptied too quickly. The only visitors now were creditors and card sharks, their shadows darkening the doorway like circling vultures. The farm's books, kept meticulously by her mother in flowing script, told the story of their downfall in stark numbers. Sarah had taught herself to read the columns, watching with growing dread as black ink turned to red, as assets became debts, as their future disappeared into the past's hungry maw. Last week, she'd overheard her father in the study with Blake and his men. Their voices had carried through the thin walls, terms like collection and consequences mixing with her father's desperate pleading. When Blake had mentioned her, "Pretty daughter you got, Mitchell. Shame if something were to happen to her." Sarah had pressed her hands against her mouth to stifle her gasp. The auction notice hadn't surprised her, not really. It was simply the last act in a tragedy that had been unfolding for years, each scene written in empty bottles and lost bets, in unpaid debts and broken promises. Her father had already sold everything else of value. She was all he had left to trade. She thought of her mother's grave on the hill behind the house, marked by a simple wooden cross. Elizabeth Mitchell had loved this land, had seen beauty in every sunrise that painted the wheat gold, in every wildflower that pushed through the tough Texas soil. What would she think of her husband now, of the choices he'd made, of the daughter he was willing to sell? James Crawford's leather-bound ledger sat open on his desk, its pages filled with neat columns of numbers that told the story of his rise from nothing to the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties. His calloused finger traced down the latest entry. 40 head of prime cattle sold at top dollar. Another successful deal that would have made his father proud if the old man had lived to see it. At 35, James had built the Crawford Ranch into an empire that stretched across 5,000 acres of Texas soil. The local bank president called him Mr. Crawford now, not that orphan boy like they had 20 years ago, when he'd arrived with nothing but determination and his father's pocket watch. Every dollar he'd earned was recorded in this ledger. Every investment carefully considered, every risk calculated. He hadn't planned to attend the auction in town that day. The mere concept turned his stomach, the selling of a human being, even if dressed up in the genteel terms of a marriage. Arrangement went against everything he believed in. But his foreman, Marcus, had brought him troubling news about Thomas Mitchell's dealings with Edwin Blake. And James had learned long ago to keep an eye on Blake's movements in the county. Standing before the mirror in his study, James straightened. His tie and brushed dust from his black coat. He cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of storm clouds and hair darkened by years under the Texas sun. Life had etched its story across his face in subtle lines, laugh lines around his eyes from genuine delight in his work, worry lines on his forehead from years of responsible decision-making, and a certain set to his jaw that spoke of hard-won wisdom. The Crawford Ranch ledger contained more than just numbers. Between the lines of profit and loss lay the philosophy that had guided him since childhood. Treat every soul with dignity, make your word your bond, and never turn away from someone in need. His father, a modest rancher whose kindness had outweighed his business sense, had taught him these principles before consumption had taken him too early. A man's true wealth, his father had said, ain't in his pocket, son. It's in how he treats those who can't offer him nothing in return. These words echoed in James's mind as he mounted his horse for the ride into town. He'd heard stories about Sarah Mitchell, whispered concerns from the church ladies about bruises glimpsed beneath her sleeves, worried reports from his ranch, hands about seeing her in town trying to sell eggs and butter to cover her father's debts. The thought of that young woman being sold to the highest bidder made his jaw clench. He knew Edwin Blake would be there. The saloon owner had been extending credit to Thomas Mitchell for months, and James suspected this auction was Blake's idea. A way to recoup his losses while adding a pretty young woman to his collection of broken souls. Blake's saloon girls tended to arrive desperate and leave destroyed, if they left at all. As his horse's hooves kicked up dust on the road to town, James found himself remembering another young woman from years ago, his sister Mary, lost to the same kind of predatory. Men that circled dying farms like vultures. He hadn't been old enough or strong enough to save her then. Perhaps today he could prevent another family's tragedy. The pocket watch his father had given him ticked steadily in his vest pocket, marking time toward a moment that would change more lives than he could imagine. James Crawford had never intended to marry. His life was ordered, successful and solitary by choice. The ranch consumed his days, the ledger balanced his nights, and he'd convinced himself that was enough. But fate, he would soon learn, had other plans. Plans that couldn't be recorded in ledgers or measured in acres. Sometimes the biggest risks offered rewards that couldn't be calculated, and the best investments weren't the ones that showed up in the bottom line. The hastily drawn marriage certificate lay on the courthouse clerk's desk, its ink still wet in the Texas heat. But before that document would seal their fates, the auction unfolded like a nightmare in broad daylight. Sarah stood on the wooden platform outside the courthouse, her thin cotton dress offering little protection against the hungry stares of the gathered men. She fixed her eyes on a distant point above their heads, trying to find dignity in the midst of degradation. Her father swayed slightly at the edge of the crowd, already half drunk despite the early hour. James Crawford's arrival caused a ripple through the assembled bidders. He dismounted gracefully from his stallion, his presence commanding immediate respect. Several men stepped back, creating a path as he made his way forward. Edwin Blake's face darkened at the sight of him. The wealthy rancher's appearance hadn't figured into his calculations. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer called out, his voice carrying across the town square, "we're here today for a unique opportunity. Miss Sarah Mitchell, 18 years of age, skilled in household duties." He continued listing her qualities like she was livestock at a county fair. The bidding started at $50. Blake's voice rang out immediately. 100. His eyes glittered with anticipated victory. 200. Called another man, his appearance suggesting he owned one of the smaller ranches outside town. Blake's jaw tightened. 300. James stood silent, watching. He noted how Sarah's hands trembled slightly, despite her rigid posture, how she flinched at each called bid. Her father had moved closer to Blake, like a cur hoping for scraps from a master's table. 5. 100, Blake announced with a smugness that suggested he thought the matter settled. $1,000. James's voice cut through the murmurs like a knife. The crowd fell silent. Sarah's eyes met his for the first time, a flash of something, hope, perhaps, crossing her face before she looked away. Blake's face reddened. 1,500, 2,000. James's response came without hesitation. You can't, Blake sputtered, but James cut him off. 3,000. The amount was more than most men in the crowd earned in a year. And I suggest we end this unseemly spectacle now. Blake's hand moved toward his gun, but thought better of it when he saw James's steady gaze. Everyone knew Crawford didn't wear a gun. He didn't need to. His power lay in his reputation and the loyalty of his men, several of whom had materialized. At the edges of the crowd. Sold, the auctioneer declared hastily, eager to conclude the increasingly tense situation. James strode forward, pulling a bank draft from his coat. But instead of handing it to Thomas Mitchell, he turned to the sheriff, who had been watching proceedings with obvious discomfort. Sheriff, I trust you'll ensure this money goes directly to settling Mr. Mitchell's debts with Mr. Blake and other creditors. It wasn't a question. The sheriff nodded, relieved to have an honorable resolution to this distasteful situation. James then approached Sarah, removing his coat and draping it gently around her shoulders. Miss Mitchell, he said softly, for her ears alone, I apologize for participating in this transaction, but I'd like to make you a different offer. He guided her down from the platform, shielding her from the crowd's view. I propose a legal marriage, properly witnessed and recorded. You'll have your own quarters at the ranch, your own allowance, and my complete respect. I ask nothing in return except the chance to protect you from... He glanced at Blake's retreating form. Situations like this. Sarah looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of deception. She found none. Why? She whispered. Because every soul deserves dignity, Miss Mitchell. And because I've seen too many young women destroyed by men like Blake. The choice is yours. I won't force you. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. Yes, she said firmly, her voice stronger than she felt. Yes, I'll marry you. Within the hour, the marriage certificate bore both their signatures, witnessed by the sheriff and the courthouse clerk. It was hardly the wedding of Sarah's childhood dreams, but as James helped her into his carriage, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. James Crawford's silver pocket watch marked each moment of their journey home, its steady, ticking a counterpoint to the carriage wheel's rhythm against the packed earth. Sarah sat across from him, still wrapped in his coat despite the afternoon heat, her eyes fixed on the passing landscape as if committing every detail to memory. The watch had been his father's final gift to him, and James found himself taking it out now, using its familiar weight to center his thoughts. It'll be about 2 hours to the ranch, he said, breaking the silence gently. We'll stop at Miller's Creek to water the horses if you'd like to rest. Sarah nodded, her fingers unconsciously working the edge of his coat. Mr. Crawford, she began. James, he corrected softly. Given the circumstances, I think we can dispense with formalities. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. James, I thank you for what you did back there, but I need to know what you expect of me. Her voice remained steady, though her knuckles whitened where they gripped the coat. He closed the watch with a quiet snap, choosing his words carefully. I expect you to feel safe, first and foremost. You'll have your own room in the East Wing. My sister's old room, actually. It has a private entrance and a key that only you will possess. He paused, gauging her reaction. Beyond that, I expect you to take time to heal, to find your footing. The ranch is large, and there's plenty of useful work if you wish it, but nothing will be forced upon you. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly. And our marriage is legal and binding, he assured her, which means no one, not your father, not Blake, not anyone, can claim any right to you. But beyond that, it will be whatever we choose to make of it in time. I meant what I said about respect, Sarah. The carriage crested a hill, and the vast expanse of Crawford Ranch spread out before them. Fields of wheat rippled like a golden sea. Cattle dotted the distant pastures, and at the heart of it all stood the main house, its whitewashed walls gleaming in the late afternoon sun. Sarah's eyes widened at the sight. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "It's home," James said simply. He noticed her hand move to her throat, where her mother's locket lay hidden. "We can send for your belongings tomorrow, if you wish." "There's nothing," she said quickly, then softened her tone. "Nothing worth retrieving except some photographs of my mother, but I wouldn't want to cause trouble." James's jaw tightened briefly. "There'll be no trouble. I'll send Marcus, my foreman, with a wagon. Your father won't interfere." They stopped at Miller's Creek as promised. James helped her down from the carriage, noting how she moved with careful precision, like someone accustomed to avoiding sudden pain. He pretended not to notice, giving her space as she walked to the creek's edge. Sarah knelt and dipped her hands in the cool water, watching her reflection fragment and reform. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I keep waiting to wake up, to find myself back in that house, hearing his footsteps on the stairs." James maintained a respectful distance. "You're awake, Sarah, and you're free." She looked up at him then, really looked at him for the first time since the auction. "Why did you come today?" "To the auction?" He took out the pocket watch again, its silver surface catching the sunlight. "My father gave me this watch when I was 12. Said it wasn't just for telling time. It was for remembering that every moment we have is a chance to do right by others." He met her gaze steadily. "I couldn't stand by and watch another good soul be broken by cruel men." The rest of their journey passed in companionable silence, but something had shifted. Sarah sat straighter, her eyes now taking in the approaching ranch with curiosity instead of fear. As they pulled up to the house, James noticed she'd finally stopped clutching his coat quite so tightly. The sun was setting as they arrived, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. "Welcome home, Sarah," James said quietly, helping her down from the carriage. And for the first time that day, her smile reached her eyes. The brass house key felt impossibly heavy in Sarah's palm as she stood before the door to her new quarters. James had presented it to her with a simple, "Your privacy is yours to keep," before having Mrs. Hanson, the housekeeper, show her to the east wing. The room exceeded anything she could have imagined. Afternoon light streamed through tall windows, illuminating walls painted the color of fresh cream. A four-poster bed, dressed in soft blue quilts, occupied one corner, while a polished wooden vanity and wardrobe stood against another wall. A small sitting area near the fireplace held two comfortable chairs and a bookshelf filled with worn volumes. "These were Mary's rooms," Mrs. Hanson explained, her grey hair neat beneath her cap, her manner brisk but kind. "Mr. Crawford's sister, God rest her soul. Haven't changed much since she passed, though we've kept them clean." She paused, studying Sarah with shrewd eyes. "He's never offered them to anyone before." Sarah ran her fingers along the spines of the books, noting titles she recognized from her mother's stories. What was she like? Mary? Mrs. Hanson's expression softened. Bright as sunshine she was, loved her books and her horses, had a laugh that could chase clouds away. She straightened a already perfect antimacassar. "The master doesn't speak of her much, but he kept her rooms just as she left them." A soft knock at the door made them both turn. James stood in the doorway, holding a small wooden box. "Mrs. Hanson, would you see about having some tea sent up, and perhaps something light to eat?" After the housekeeper departed, James entered the room, maintaining a respectful distance. "This was Mary's jewelry box," he said, placing it on the vanity. "She would have wanted someone to use it, rather than letting it gather dust." Sarah opened the box carefully, finding it lined with faded velvet. "Thank you," she whispered, touching her mother's locket at her throat. "For everything. There are fresh clothes in the wardrobe," he continued. "Nothing fancy. Mrs. Hanson helped select some practical things from the mercantile. We can arrange for more once you're settled." He cleared his throat. "I thought you might like to rest before dinner." But if you're feeling up to it, I could show you around the house first." The tour revealed a home that managed to be both imposing and welcoming. The library's floor-to-ceiling shelves made Sarah's heart skip a beat, while the conservatory's collection of thriving plants spoke of careful tending. The kitchen was a warm hub of activity, with Mrs. Hanson directing her small staff with quiet efficiency. "You're welcome anywhere in the house," James explained as they walked, "though I tend to work in my study most evenings." He showed her the dining room, where 2 places had been set at the long table. "We usually eat at 7, but that can be adjusted to whatever suits you." Sarah found herself studying him when he wasn't looking. In the softening evening light, his features seemed less stern than they had at the auction. There was a gentleness in how he spoke to the servants, a quiet authority that demanded respect without requiring fear. They ended the tour on the wide back porch, where the setting sun painted the ranch in shades of amber. A few ranch hands were returning from the fields, their distant figures silhouetted against the sky. The sounds of horses being settled for the night drifted from the barn, mingling with the evening song of meadowlarks. "I know this isn't how you imagined your life would be," James said finally, his hands resting on the porch railing, "and I know trust must be earned, but I hope you'll find some peace here, Sarah." She thought of her key, tucked safely in her pocket, of the private rooms that were now hers alone, of the gentle way this near stranger had helped her down from his carriage, as if she were something precious rather than purchased. "Mr. Crawford." "James," she corrected herself. "Why did you really save me today?" He was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. "Because 20 years ago, I couldn't save my sister from men like Blake, because every person deserves the chance to choose their own path." He turned to face her, "and because sometimes doing right is its own reward." As they stood there in the gathering dusk, Sarah felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. It took her a moment to recognize it as hope. The riding gloves lay on Sarah's breakfast plate the next morning, supple leather worked soft as butter. A note in James's precise handwriting accompanied them. "If you're interested in learning, I'll be at the stables at 10. No pressure, J. Sarah." Touched the gloves hesitantly. She'd never been allowed near horses at her father's farm. Too expensive, too dangerous, he'd always said. But she'd watched the ranch hands with their mounts yesterday, saw the easy partnership between rider and horse, and something in her yearned toward that freedom. At precisely 10, she found herself walking toward the stables, the new gloves clutched. In her hands, James was there as promised, brushing down a gentle-looking mare with a cream-colored coat. He smiled when he saw her, but didn't stop his methodical strokes with the brush. "This is Daisy," he said by way of greeting. "Mary's old horse, gentlest soul on 4 legs." He patted the mare's neck. "Would you like to meet her?" Sarah approached. Carefully, remembering how she used to calm frightened animals on the farm, Daisy turned her head, regarding her with liquid brown eyes. "She's beautiful," Sarah breathed, reaching out slowly. "Here," James said, moving to stand beside her. "She likes to be scratched right here behind her ear." His hands guided hers, showing her the spot, then withdrew immediately. "See, she's already taking to you." The next hour passed in a blur of basic instruction. James taught her how to approach a horse, how to read their body language, how to earn their trust. "Horses are honest creatures," he explained. "They can sense fear and kindness alike. Show them respect, and they'll return it tenfold." When it came time to mount up, Sarah's hands trembled slightly. James pretended not to notice, instead focusing on checking Daisy's tack one more time. "The trick," he said, demonstrating the mounting motion, "is to move with confidence, even if you don't feel it yet. Horses respond to certainty." Sarah gripped the saddle horn, took a deep breath, and pulled herself up, as he'd shown her. The world looked different from horseback, larger somehow. James adjusted her stirrups, explaining each movement before he made it, always careful to telegraph his intentions. "Now," he said, taking Daisy's lead rope, We'll just walk a bit, get you used to the motion. You set the pace. Daisy and I will follow your lead." They made slow circles in the paddock, James walking alongside, offering quiet instruction. "Sit. Tall," he'd say, or "remember to breathe." When Sarah finally relaxed enough to laugh at one of Daisy's head tosses, his smile reached his eyes. "My sister would have loved teaching you," he said after a while, his voice soft with memory. "She believed every woman should know how to ride. Said it was the closest thing to having wings." Sarah thought about Mary's room, preserved like a memory, and about the brother who carried her loss like a weight. "What happened to her?" she asked gently. James was quiet for several steps. "She fell in with a man who promised her the world. By the time I realized what kind of man he really was, she was gone. I searched for months, but—" He cleared his throat. "That's why I couldn't stand by yesterday. Some debts can never be repaid, but some wrongs can be prevented." Sarah absorbed this in silence, understanding better now the depths behind his actions. When they finished the lesson, her muscles ached, but something else had shifted too. A barrier within her had begun to crack. "Same time tomorrow?" James asked, as he helped her down, his hand steady but impersonal on her waist. "Only if you wish, of course." Sarah looked at Daisy, who nudged her shoulder gently, then at the riding gloves she now wore like a second skin. "Yes," she said firmly, "I'd like that." As she walked back to the house, she caught sight of her reflection in a window. The woman looking back seemed different somehow, straighter, taller, more sure. The riding gloves felt like a promise of freedom, of possibility, of a future she might choose for herself. Behind her she heard James speaking softly to Daisy, his voice carrying on the morning breeze. "You did well, old girl. You did well." Sarah's journal lay open on her desk, its pages filling with more than just the day's events. What had started as a simple record-keeping exercise, suggested by James as a way to track her riding progress, had become a chronicle of her transformation. "Today, I helped Mrs. Hanson with the preserve making," she wrote, her penmanship growing stronger with each entry. "My mother's recipe for wild plum jam came back to me like a half-remembered dream. Mrs. H says it's the best she's tasted in 30 years of cooking. For a moment stirring that pot, I felt Mama standing beside me, guiding my hands like she used to." The morning sun streamed through her windows as she continued writing. "James asked me to look over the household accounts yesterday," said Mrs. Hanson. "Could use help with the bookkeeping, but I suspect he noticed how I linger in the library, studying his father's old ledgers. The numbers speak to me in a way they never did when father forced me to balance his gambling debts." 3 weeks had passed since the auction, and Sarah found herself settling into a rhythm at Crawford Ranch. Mornings began with riding lessons, which had progressed from simple walks to confident trots. James remained a patient teacher, offering guidance without pressure, praise without condescension. "Daisy and I cantered today," she wrote, smiling at the memory, "just for a moment, around the corner of the paddock. But oh, what freedom in that feeling, like flying across the earth itself. James said my seat was natural, that I ride like Mary did. He speaks of her more often now, sharing little stories during our lessons. I think the memories bring him peace." Ranch hands had begun tipping their hats to her, calling her Mrs. Crawford, with genuine respect rather than the awkward formality of those first days. She'd earned their regard by learning their names, remembering how they took their coffee, ensuring Mrs. Hanson always prepared extra biscuits for the morning break. "Cook showed me how to make the special chili sauce the men love," her journal entry continued. "Said it was about time someone else learned the secret recipe, seeing as she's not getting any younger. The kitchen feels like home now, warm with conversation and the smell of fresh bread, so different from those silent meals at father's table." Sarah paused in her writing, touching her mother's locket. She'd begun wearing it openly now, no longer feeling the need to hide this piece of her past. James had noticed it yesterday, commenting on the fine silverwork. When she'd told him about her mother, he'd listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed he cared about understanding who Elizabeth Mitchell had been. "The ledgers show a profit this quarter," she wrote, pride seeping into her words. "My suggestions about reorganizing the kitchen stores have saved more than expected." James actually smiled when I showed him the calculations, a real smile, the kind that crinkles the corners of his eyes. He's different when he smiles like that. Younger, somehow, less weighted by responsibility. Outside her window, the ranch was coming alive with morning activity. Ranch hands moved between the barn and the fields, horses nickered in their stalls, and the smell of breakfast drifted up from the kitchen. These sounds and scents had become familiar, comforting in their constancy. "I'm learning who I am here," she wrote, the words flowing freely now. "Not someone's daughter or possession, but simply Sarah. I can speak without fear of sharp words in return. I can move through the house without tracking the sound of angry footsteps. I can exist without making myself smaller." She described the small victories, successfully managing the monthly supply order, helping to break in a new colt, teaching one of the younger ranch hands to read during evening lessons. Each accomplishment added another brick to the foundation of her new life. "James watches me sometimes," she concluded that morning's entry, "when he thinks I won't notice. Not like father's men used to watch, with hunger or calculation. He watches, like someone witnessing a flower unfurling toward the sun, with quiet wonder and infinite patience. It makes me feel—" Her pen hovered over the page. "Safe," she finally wrote. "It makes me feel safe." The damaged barn door hung precariously from its hinges, its weathered wood no match for the fury of the Texas storm. Sarah stood in the driving rain, her hair plastered to her face, helping James and two ranch hands brace it against the howling wind. Lightning split the sky, illuminating their desperate work in stark flashes. "The horses!" she shouted over the thunder. Several of the animals were still trapped inside, their frightened whinnies cutting through the storm's rage. Without waiting for permission, she ducked under James's arm and into the barn. "Sarah!" His voice carried a note she'd never heard before. Fear, not for himself, but for her. She heard his boots behind her on the wooden floor as she moved toward Daisy's stall. The barn creaked ominously overhead. Through gaps in the roof, rain poured in sheets, turning the floor treacherous. Sarah reached Daisy, speaking soft words as she worked the latch. "Easy, girl. Easy now." The mare's eyes rolled white with fear, but she responded to the familiar voice. James appeared beside her, leading two other horses. "Get them to the south barn," he directed, his usual calm authority steady even now. "Marcus and Tom will help. I'll get the rest. I'm coming back to help," she insisted, already leading Daisy toward the door. Their eyes met in another flash of lightning, and something passed between them. Trust, partnership, understanding. The journey to the south barn was a battle against wind and rain. Sarah's riding lessons proved their worth as she guided the frightened horses through the storm. Her muscles ached, but she pressed on, making 2 more trips until all the horses were safely relocated. When she returned the final time, she found James wrestling with the damaged door. Without a word, she took position opposite him, throwing her weight against the wood. Together, they managed to secure it with rope and stakes, creating a temporary barrier against the storm's assault. Only then did they pause, breathing hard, rain running in rivulets down their faces. James reached out suddenly, his hand gentle, on her cheek. "You're bleeding," he said, his voice rough with concern. Sarah touched her face, finding a small cut from flying debris. "It's nothing," she assured him, but she didn't move away from his touch. For a moment they stood frozen, the storm raging around them, while something equally powerful stirred in the space between them. A tremendous crack of thunder broke the spell. "We should check the other buildings," Sarah said, reluctantly stepping back. James nodded, his hand falling to his side. They worked through the night, moving in perfect synchronization. Sarah organized the handswives to prepare hot coffee and food, directed the securing of loose equipment, and helped James assess damage to the outbuildings. Her previous life on a farm, though painful in memory, had taught her well what needed doing in such weather. Near dawn, the storm finally began to ease. Sarah stood in the kitchen, passing out hot coffee to exhausted ranch hands, when she overheard Marcus speaking to James. "Never seen anything like it, boss," the foreman said, admiration clear in his voice. Mrs. Crawford handled herself like she was born to it, knew exactly what needed doing, and wasn't afraid to do it. James's response was quiet, but carried clearly in the pre-dawn stillness. "She's stronger than anyone knows, Marcus, including herself." Later, as the sun broke through the clouds, Sarah and James walked the property together, assessing the night's damage. The damaged barn door would need replacing, and several fences had suffered, but no animals had been lost, no serious harm done. "Thank you," James said suddenly, pausing in their inspection. "For last night, for everything." Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, taking in the tired lines around his eyes, the way his usually neat hair curled damply at his collar. "We're partners, aren't we?" she said simply. "That's what marriage is supposed to be." Something flickered in his expression, surprise, warmth, and perhaps something deeper. "Yes," he agreed softly, "that's exactly what it's supposed to be." They stood together in the fresh morning light, watching the sun burn away the storm's remnants. The damaged door behind them seemed less like destruction now, and more like a marker of change, a moment when old barriers had broken, allowing something new to emerge. The town newspaper lay folded on the mercantile counter, its bold headline catching Sarah's eye: "Crawford Ranch flourishing under new management." Below, in smaller print, "James Crawford's unexpected marriage proves beneficial for local economy." Sarah pretended not to notice as Mrs. Peterson, the merchant's wife, nudged Mrs. Bailey, their heads bent together over the paper. It was her first trip into town since the auction 6 weeks ago now, and James had insisted on accompanying her, despite his busy schedule. "The monthly supplies won't order themselves," he'd said with a slight smile, offering her his arm as they descended from the carriage. Sarah had accepted it, drawing strength from his steady presence, as curious eyes followed their progress down the main street. Now, as she reviewed her carefully prepared list with Mr. Peterson, she could hear the whispers behind her. "Bought her right off the auction block, they say," one woman murmured. "But look at her now, dressed like a proper lady." Sarah smoothed her new blue calico dress, chosen with Mrs. Hanson's help. She'd pinned her mother's locket at her throat that morning, its familiar weight anchoring her against the tide of gossip. 4 dozen eggs," she continued calmly, "and we'll need more sugar than usual. Mrs. Hanson is teaching me her preserve recipes." Her voice carried clearly, steady and dignified, causing several whisperers to fall silent. James, discussing cattle prices with another rancher nearby, moved subtly closer to her. He didn't interrupt her business, didn't try to take over the transactions, just positioned himself where his presence would remind others to mind their manners. "Did you hear about her father?" Mrs. Bailey's voice rose slightly. "Drinking himself to death in Blake's saloon, they say. Hasn't been sober since the auction." Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she counted out money for the supplies. James was beside her instantly, not taking over, but standing close enough that his arm brushed hers. "Would you like to review the ledger entries with me, Sarah?" he asked, loud enough to be heard. "Your system for tracking household expenses has been remarkably efficient." She met his eyes, seeing the quiet support there. "Of course," she replied, matching his professional tone. Together they bent over his ledger, creating a bubble of privacy in the busy store. "Remarkable," Mrs. Peterson said later to her husband, not bothering to lower her voice. "She handles the ranch accounts now, I hear. Quite a change from that scared girl on the auction block." "She was never just that scared girl," James said suddenly, his voice carrying in the now quiet store. "She was always this capable, this strong. Some of us were simply wise enough to see it." He turned to Sarah. "Shall we visit the bookshop next? I believe the new medical texts you ordered have arrived." Sarah gathered her dignity around her like a cloak. "Yes, thank you. Good day, Mr. Peterson, Mrs. Peterson." She nodded to the other ladies, whose whispers had fallen silent in the face of James's quiet declaration. In the bookshop, away from prying eyes, Sarah finally allowed her shoulders to relax. "You didn't have to defend me," she said softly, running her fingers along the spines of new books. "I didn't," James replied, watching her with that steady gaze that always seemed to see straight to her heart. "I simply spoke the truth. Though," he added with a slight smile, "I admit I enjoyed reminding them of it." As they loaded the supplies into their carriage later, Sarah noticed a change in the townspeople's behavior. The whispers continued, but their tone had shifted. She caught fragments. "Way she manages that ranch," and "Crawford's never looked better," and even "quite the suitable match after all." James helped her into the carriage, his hand warm and sure around hers. As they drove home, the setting sun painting the prairie in shades of gold, Sarah found herself speaking. "I used to dream of escaping to town, you know. Thought anywhere would be better than that farm." She touched her locket thoughtfully. "Now I can't wait to get back to the ranch, back home." The word hung in the air between them, both an admission and a revelation. James's hands tightened slightly on the reins, but his voice was gentle when he replied, "Home it is, then." Behind them, the town's gossip faded into the distance, as insubstantial as dust in the wind. Ahead, the familiar silhouette of Crawford Ranch rose against the horizon, solid and welcoming as a promise kept. The threatening letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, its crude handwriting barely legible through whiskey stains. "Crawford, your wife's my daughter, worth more than you paid. Come settle up proper, or there'll be trouble." Sarah found it on James's desk while organizing the morning mail, her hands trembling as she recognized her father's scrawl. For a moment, she was that frightened girl again, listening for heavy footsteps on creaking floorboards. Then she straightened her spine, squared her shoulders, and did what she'd learned to do in her new life. She faced the problem head-on. James was in the barn, discussing breeding lines with Marcus when she found him. He took one look at her face and excused himself, leading her to a quiet corner. Without a word, she handed him the letter. His expression darkened as he read, but his voice remained steady. "We knew this might happen eventually. What do you want to do?" The question startled her. In her old life, no one had ever asked what she wanted. She began, then found her strength. "I want to face him. With you. I need him to understand that I'm not his to sell anymore." James nodded, studying her face. "Are you sure? We could have the sheriff handle this." "No," Sarah said firmly. "I need to do this myself. For Mary." Understanding flickered in his eyes at the mention of his sister. He reached out, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "For Mary, then. And for you." They didn't have to wait long. That afternoon, Thomas Mitchell's unsteady figure appeared at the ranch gate, accompanied by two rough-looking men Sarah recognized from Blake's saloon. She watched from the study window as James walked out to meet them, his stance relaxed but alert. "Stay inside," he'd told her, but Sarah had learned something about partnership in these past months. She stepped onto the porch, letting the screen door close softly behind her. "That's my property you're keeping," her father slurred, pointing a shaking finger at her. "Worth twice what you paid, Crawford. Time to settle up." "Your daughter," James corrected quietly, "is my wife, and she's not property at all." "Wife?" Thomas spat. "That ain't no proper marriage. Everyone knows you bought her like cattle." "No." "Father," Sarah's voice rang out clear and strong as she descended the porch steps. "James saved me from being sold like cattle. There's a difference." Her father's bloodshot eyes widened at her transformation. Gone was the hunched, fearful girl. In her place stood a woman who carried herself with dignity, who met his gaze without flinching. "Look at you," he sneered, but there was something else in his voice, confusion, perhaps even fear. "All dressed up like a fine lady. Think you're better than you're raising now?" "I'm exactly what I always was," Sarah replied. "You just never bothered to see it." She moved to stand beside James, drawing strength from his presence. Go home, father. Get help. But don't come back here thinking you can sell me twice. One of Blake's men stepped forward, hand moving toward his gun. Before he could reach it, Marcus and 3 other ranch hands emerged from the barn, rifles ready but pointed at the ground. A clear warning. Think carefully, James said softly, dangerously. About your next move. Thomas Mitchell looked from his daughter to his armed companions, then back to Sarah. For a moment, something like recognition flickered in his eyes, perhaps seeing Elizabeth in her daughter's stance, in the determined set of her jaw. "You sound like your mother," he said, his voice suddenly old and tired. "Yes," Sarah agreed, "I do, and she would be ashamed of what you've become." The words struck home. Thomas seemed to deflate, the anger draining from him like water from a broken vessel. Without another word, he turned and stumbled back toward his waiting horse. His companions, seeing the odds, followed. James waited until they were out of sight before turning to Sarah. "Are you all right?" She realized she was trembling, but not from fear. "I did it," she whispered. "I stood up to him." "You did more than that," James said, pride evident in his voice. "You set yourself free." That evening, Sarah wrote a final entry in her journal about her father, not in anger or sorrow, but with a kind of peace. The last lines read, "Today I faced my past and found it smaller than I remembered. Perhaps that's what healing means. Not forgetting the wounds, but growing larger than them." She sealed the letter from her father in an envelope, filed it away in James's desk, and closed that chapter of her life. Outside her window, the sun was setting on Crawford Ranch, and tomorrow was waiting to begin. Between the pages of Sarah's journal lay a pressed wildflower, a delicate prairie rose, its pink petals preserved from the afternoon that changed everything. She'd been riding fence with James, something that had become their shared ritual in the weeks following her father's visit. The autumn air held the first hint of crispness, and the prairie stretched endless and golden around them. "My mother loved these roses," Sarah said, dismounting to pick one that grew beside a fence post. "She said they were proof that beautiful things could flourish even in the hardest places." She turned the bloom in her fingers, remembering. "We used to press them between the pages of her Bible." James had drawn midnight to a halt beside her, watching her with that quiet intensity that made her heart flutter these days. "Mary pressed flowers too," he offered. "Had books full of them, said each one told a story." "What story would this one tell, do you think?" Sarah asked, looking up at him. He'd smiled then, one of his rare, full smiles that transformed his entire face. "That depends on who's doing the telling, I suppose." They'd spent the afternoon checking fence lines, but somehow the conversation flowed easier than before. James spoke of his childhood, of learning ranching at his father's knee, of the dreams he'd had for Crawford Ranch. Sarah shared memories of her mother, good ones that didn't hurt so much anymore, and her own dreams of learning medicine, a secret she'd never voiced aloud before. "The town doctor's been looking for an apprentice," James said thoughtfully. "He mentioned it last week when he was out treating Miller's broken arm." Sarah's heart jumped. "But that's not traditionally a woman's role." "Since when?" James asked, his eyes twinkling. "Have you been traditional?" They stopped to rest the horses by Miller's Creek, the same spot where they'd paused on that first journey to the ranch. Sarah sat on a sun-warmed rock, watching James lead the horses to water. He moved with an easy grace that spoke of years in the saddle, confident but never arrogant. "I've been thinking," he said, returning to sit nearby, "about our marriage." Sarah's breath caught. They hadn't spoken directly about the nature of their relationship since that first day, letting it evolve naturally from arrangement to partnership, to something more. "These past months," he continued, choosing his words carefully, "you've transformed this ranch. The books haven't been this well managed since my father's time. The house feels alive again. The men respect you, the town accepts you, and I—" He paused, looking out over the creek. "You what?" Sarah asked softly. "I find myself watching you," he admitted. "When you're working with the ledgers, your face all serious with concentration. When you're helping Mrs. Hanson teach the young ranch hand to read." When you're riding Daisy, like you were born in the saddle." He turned to meet her eyes. "I watch you and think about how grateful I am that I went to that auction, even though I hate the circumstances that brought you here." Sarah's fingers found her mother's locket, a gesture that had become more comfort than defense. "I'm grateful too," she whispered, "not just for the rescue, but for everything after, for giving me space to find myself, for treating me like a person instead of property, for—" she gathered her courage, "for being someone I could fall in love with." The words hung in the air between them, as delicate as the prairie rose she still held. James reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and covered her hand with his. "Sarah," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I think I've been falling in love with you since the day you faced down that storm with me." She turned her hand in his, twining their fingers together. "What happens now?" "Whatever we want," he replied. "This is a real marriage now, or it could be, if that's what you choose." Sarah looked at their joined hands, at the prairie rose she held, at the man who had given her freedom, and then waited patiently while she learned how to use it. "I choose you," she said simply. "I choose us." When they rode back to the ranch that evening, something had shifted between them. Sarah pressed the prairie rose between the pages of her journal, marking the moment when their marriage of convenience blossomed into something true and tender, like a wild rose growing strong. In rocky soil, the blue ribbon from the county fair's riding competition lay across Sarah's palm, its satin surface catching the late afternoon light. She could hardly believe it was real, this tangible proof that she belonged in this new world she'd entered. The day had started early, with James helping her prepare Daisy for the competition. "Remember," he'd said as he checked the saddle one final time, "you've nothing to prove to anyone but yourself." But they both knew that wasn't entirely true. The county fair drew people from all the surrounding towns, including many who remembered her only as Thomas Mitchell's daughter, the girl sold at auction. This was her chance to show them, and herself, how far she'd come. "Mrs. Crawford," Judge Anderson had called, and Sarah had guided Daisy into the ring with her head held high. The crowd's whispers followed her, but she focused on James's teaching. Sit tall, breathe steady, trust your horse. The pattern they'd practiced came naturally now. Walk, trot, canter, each transition smooth as silk. Daisy responded to the lightest touch, their months of working together evident in every graceful movement. When they executed a perfect figure eight, Sarah caught a glimpse of James at the rail, his face glowing with pride. "Would you look at that?" she heard Mrs. Peterson say to her neighbor. "She rides like she was born to it." The final element was the jump course, 3 modest obstacles that would have terrified Sarah just months ago. Now she guided Daisy through them with confident precision, their timing perfect, their partnership complete. As they cleared the last jump, Sarah felt tears of joy threatening. They lined up with the other competitors for judging, 6 riders who had once seemed so intimidating. Sarah sat straight in her saddle, feeling the sun warm on her face, knowing she'd done her best regardless of the outcome. "First place," Judge Anderson announced, "goes to Mrs. Sarah Crawford on Daisy." The blue ribbon had been pinned to Daisy's. Bridle-less applause rippled through the crowd. James had helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Mary would have been so proud," he'd whispered, and Sarah had seen the shimmer of tears in his eyes. Now, hours later, they sat together on the front porch swing, the ribbon between them. The fair's excitement had faded into peaceful evening, with crickets singing in the grass and the first stars appearing above. "I didn't just win for myself today," Sarah said softly. "I won for Mary too, and for my mother, and for every girl who's ever been told she's nothing but property to be sold." James took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "You won because you worked hard and rode beautifully. But yes, you showed them all what courage looks like." Sarah leaned against him, feeling the solid strength of his shoulder. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day, about treating me with respect?" "Every word. You did more than that," she said. "You gave me the space to respect myself, to become someone I could be proud of." "You were always someone to be proud of," James corrected gently. "You just needed the freedom to show it." The ribbon gleamed in the gathering dusk, its blue as deep as the evening sky. Sarah thought about the girl she'd been, trembling on an auction block, and marveled at how far she'd come. Not just in riding skill, but in confidence, in strength, in the ability to love and be loved in return. "I've been thinking," James said after a while, "about what you said about studying medicine. Dr. Jenkins would be proud to have you as an apprentice. The ranch can spare you 3 days a week if you're interested." Sarah turned to look at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. "You'd really support that?" "Sarah," he said, bringing their joined hands to his lips, "I'd support anything that helps you grow. You've proven you can handle both ranch and medical studies. Besides," he smiled, "a doctor in the family would be mighty useful." Family. The word warmed her heart. This man who had bought her freedom had given her so much more, a home, a purpose, a love that grew stronger each day. The blue ribbon would be hung in the study alongside James's father's original ranch deed and Mary's pressed flower collection. Not just a prize, but a milestone marking her journey from property to partner, from victim to victor. The doctor's note lay crumpled in Sarah's trembling hands. "Mr. Crawford, severe concussion, 3 broken ribs, complete bed rest required. No business matters for minimum 2 weeks. She'd read it so many times the words had begun to blur, but she couldn't bring herself to set it aside. The accident had happened so quickly. One moment James was working with the new stallion in the corral. The next he was lying motionless in the dirt, thrown when the horse spooked at a rattlesnake. Sarah had been in the barn when she heard Marcus's shout, and the world had stopped turning at the sight of James's still form. Now she sat beside his bed, watching the shallow rise and fall of his chest. Dr. Jenkins had just left, having done what he could for the injuries. "The next 24 hours are critical," he'd said, patting her shoulder. "Call me if his condition changes. And Sarah, perhaps it's time you started those medical lessons we discussed. You handled yourself well today." She had moved automatically through the crisis, directing the ranch hands, sending for the doctor, helping prepare poultices and bandages. Only now, in the quiet of James's room, did she allow herself to feel the terror that had gripped her heart. "You're not allowed to leave me," she whispered, taking his hand. "Not when I've just found you. Not when I've finally learned what real love feels like." His fingers twitched in hers, but he didn't wake. The bruise on his temple had darkened to purple, and his breathing carried a worrying rasp. Sarah found herself counting each breath, terrified they might stop. Mrs. Hanson appeared with tea and soup, her usual brisk manner softened by concern. "You need to eat something, child," she said, setting down the tray. "The ranch won't run itself, and Mr. Crawford will need you strong when he wakes." The ranch. Sarah straightened, suddenly remembering all the responsibilities that couldn't wait for James's recovery. The monthly payroll was due, supplies needed ordering, and the new breeding contracts required immediate attention. "I'll handle it," she said, surprising herself with her certainty. "I know the books, the schedules, everything we've been working on together. Will you stay with him while I speak with Marcus?" The foreman was waiting in James's study, his weathered face drawn with worry. Sarah took her place behind the desk, James's desk, and pulled out the ledgers. "We'll continue operations as normal," she declared, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "The men's pay will be distributed on schedule. I'll handle the contracts and supply orders. You'll oversee the daily work as always, reporting to me until James recovers." Marcus nodded, relief evident in his expression. "Yes, ma'am. The men were hoping you'd take charge. They trust you, Mrs. Crawford. We all do." Sarah worked through the night, moving between the study and James's bedside. She reviewed contracts, wrote letters to their business partners explaining the situation, and organized the week's work schedules. Between tasks, she bathed James's forehead with cool cloths, whispering to him about everything she was doing. To keep his beloved ranch running, Dawn found her dozing in the chair beside his bed, ledgers spread across her lap. A rough cough startled her awake, and she found James's eyes, clouded with pain but blessedly aware, fixed on her face. Sarah. His voice was weak, but it was the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard. "Don't try to move," she said, reaching for the water glass. "You've been unconscious for almost a day." He took a small sip, then caught sight of the papers scattered around her. "The ranch is fine," she assured him. "Everything's handled. Marcus and I have it all under control. You just focus on healing." James managed a weak smile. "My capable wife," he murmured. "What would I do without you?" The words struck Sarah like a physical blow, making her realize how close she'd come to finding out what life without him would be like. Tears she'd been holding back all night finally spilled over. "Don't you dare make me find out," she choked out. "I love you, James Crawford. I love you so much it terrifies me." He lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her fingers despite the obvious pain the movement caused. "I love you too," he whispered. "Not because I saved you, or because you're saving me now, but because you're you, Sarah, my partner, my heart." The doctor's note fluttered to the floor, forgotten. Outside, the ranch was coming alive with morning sounds. Horses nickering, men calling greetings, wagon, wheels on packed earth. Their world continued turning, stronger now for having faced this crisis together. The sheriff's report lay unsigned on his desk, its official language stark and clear. Attempted assault with deadly intent, Edwin Blake and Thomas Mitchell having conspired to abduct Mrs. Sarah Crawford, citizens' arrest by Crawford Ranch hands, witnesses confirm acts of self-defense. Sarah stood by the window of the sheriff's office, her hand instinctively seeking James's as they listened to their statements being read back. The events of the previous night still felt surreal, like a nightmare finally confronted and overcome. Blake and her father had waited until James was still recovering from his injuries, thinking the ranch would be vulnerable. They hadn't counted on Sarah's strength, or the loyalty of the ranch hands, or the way the whole town had rallied to the Crawfords' defense. "Tell me again what happened," the sheriff requested, dipping his pen in ink. From the beginning, Sarah's voice was steady as she began. "I was closing up the barn for the night when I heard them. Father, Mr. Mitchell, was drunk again, but Blake was stone-cold sober. They thought James was still bedridden, didn't know he'd started moving around the house." The memory unfolded with crystal clarity. Blake's cold voice in the darkness, her father's slurred demands, the smell of whiskey and desperation. "Time to come home, girl," Thomas had growled. "Got a buyer willing to pay triple what Crawford did." "I am home," she had replied, backing toward the barn door where she knew Marcus kept a loaded rifle. "And I'm not for sale, not anymore." Blake had moved then, moonlight glinting off his pistol. "Don't make this difficult, Mrs. Crawford. Your husband's laid up, your hands are in the bunkhouse. Nobody needs to get hurt." What they hadn't known was that Sarah had developed a signal with the ranch hands after James's accident. 3 sharp whistles meant trouble. The sound had cut through the night air clear as a bell, and the response had been immediate. "The men came running from every direction," Sarah continued, speaking to the sheriff's careful notes. "And James—" She squeezed his hand, remembering. The terror of seeing him struggle out to the barn, still favoring his injured side. "My wife," James picked up the story, "had the situation well in hand by the time I arrived. She'd managed to get to Marcus's rifle and was holding them at bay. Blake panicked when he saw the hands surrounding them. He fired wild, and that's when young Tom Harris was hit," the sheriff interjected, indicating the wound report attached to his statement. "Nothing serious, thankfully. The hands subdued them both," Sarah finished. "Held them here in town until you returned from your rounds. Blake kept raving about revenge, about teaching us our place. Father just cried." The sheriff nodded grimly. "Blake's had this coming for years, throwing his weight around, preying on desperate folks. Between this and the outstanding warrants from Austin, He straightened his papers. He'll be going away for a long time. As for your father, Mrs. Crawford, Sarah met the sheriff's eyes. I'll not press charges against him. The drink and Blake's influence. She shook her head. He needs help, not jail. There's a good sanitarium in Dallas, James offered quietly. I've already sent word. They'll take him, help him dry out, if he lets them. The sheriff's weathered face softened as he watched them together. You've built something special here, he said, indicating their clasped hands. Whole town seen it. What started as something less than proper, has turned into a right fine example of what marriage ought to be. Outside the office, the town was beginning to stir with morning activity. Sarah could hear Mrs. Peterson telling anyone who'd listen how she'd always known Sarah Crawford was a lady of quality. How the whole ugly business just proved what fine folks the Crawfords were. Ready to go home? James asked softly. Sarah nodded, thinking of the ranch waiting for them, of the life they'd built together. Blake can't hurt anyone now, she said. And father, maybe he'll finally find peace. And us? James's eyes held a mixture of pride and tender concern. We'll do what we've always done, she replied, smoothing his lapel where it had wrinkled during the long night. Face whatever comes. Together, the sheriff's report would be filed away, becoming just another document in the town's records. But its existence marked the end of Sarah's old life and the final victory of her new one, not just as James Crawford's wife, but as her own woman, strong enough to face down the demons of her past. The love letter sat in the center of Sarah's. Vanity, James's strong handwriting flowing across the cream-colored paper. My dearest Sarah, when I first saw you on that auction block, I wanted to save you. What I never expected was that you would save me too. Sarah traced the words with trembling fingers, remembering how she'd found the letter that morning, tucked beneath her mother's locket where she always left it at night. The timing wasn't coincidental. Exactly 1 year had passed since that. Fateful day at the auction. You've brought life back to Crawford Ranch, the letter continued. Not just in the ledgers, which have never been better managed, or in the household, which runs with smooth efficiency. You've brought life back to me. Every morning when I wake, my first thought is of gratitude that you're here. Every evening when we sit together on the porch, I thank God for bringing you into my life. A soft knock at her door interrupted her. Reading. Sarah? James's voice carried through the wood. Are you ready? Come in, she called, quickly wiping away happy tears. He entered, looking uncommonly nervous in his best suit. I see you found my letter. I did. She stood, smoothing her blue silk dress, the one she'd worn the day she won the riding competition. James Crawford, are you actually blushing? He smiled, that special smile that transformed his whole face, and was reserved only for her. Maybe. There's more I wanted to say, but writing's easier sometimes than speaking. Then read it to me, she suggested, holding out the letter. Right now. James took the paper, his hands steady, but his voice soft with emotion. Sarah, we began as a marriage of convenience, born of my desire to protect and your need for safety. But somewhere, between that first carriage ride and now, between riding lessons and storm-damaged barns, between ledger entries and shared dreams, I fell so completely in love with you that I can hardly remember what life was like before. He looked up from the letter, meeting her eyes. Our first wedding was a hasty affair at the courthouse, meant to secure your freedom. But you deserve more than that. You deserve a celebration of what we've become together. From his pocket, he drew out a simple gold ring. Sarah Crawford, would you marry me again? Not to save you this time, but because I love you and want to spend the rest of my life as your true partner. Sarah felt tears spilling down her cheeks, but she was smiling so broadly her face hurt. Yes, she whispered. 1,000 times yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger where it caught the morning light. I thought we could have the ceremony here at the ranch, under the old oak tree where we sometimes have our evening talks. Just our friends, the Hands and their families, people who've supported us this past year. "And Mary's roses blooming all around," Sarah added, thinking of the wild roses she'd transplanted to the garden in memory of his sister. "It's perfect." James drew her close, his arms strong and sure around her. "You know, that day at the auction, Marcus thought I was crazy, said buying a wife was asking for trouble." He chuckled softly. "Told him some trouble was worth having." "And now?" Sarah asked, looking up at him. "Now I know it wasn't trouble I was buying at all. It was a miracle. Wearing your mother's locket and trying so hard to be brave." Sarah reached up to touch his face, wondering at how this man who had once been her rescuer had become her heart's home. "I love you," she said simply, "not because you saved me, but because you showed me I could save myself, because you've been patient and kind and strong, because you're you." James caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "I love you too. Not because you've made the ranch prosper or because you've brought joy back to this house, but because you're the strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever known." The letter fluttered forgotten to the floor as he drew her into a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. Outside, the ranch was coming alive with morning sounds, but for this moment their world consisted only of each other and the love that had grown from the most unlikely of beginnings. Later, they would plan their wedding celebration, would share. Their joy with their ranch family would begin the next chapter of their story. But for now they simply held each other, two hearts that had found their way home against all odds. The family portrait hung in pride of place above the study fireplace, capturing a moment from their second wedding day beneath the old oak tree. Sarah stood radiant in her mother's restored wedding dress, James beside her looking younger than he had in years, both of them surrounded by blooming prairie roses and the smiling faces of their ranch family. 2 years had passed since that first desperate day at the auction block, and life at Crawford Ranch had settled into a rhythm as natural as breathing. Sarah divided her time between managing the ranch books and her medical studies with Dr. Jenkins, while James had finally begun to delegate more responsibilities, trusting in the partnership they'd built. "Another letter from your father," James said, entering the study where Sarah sat reviewing the quarterly accounts. He placed the envelope on her desk, then moved to stand behind her chair, his hands gentle on her shoulders. Sarah set down her pen and picked up the letter. The sanitarium in Dallas had worked wonders. Thomas Mitchell's handwriting was steady now, his words clear and remorseful. "He's being released next month," she said after reading. "The doctors say he's maintained his sobriety for 6 months. How do you feel about that?" James asked quietly. She reached up to cover his hand with hers. "At peace, actually. He's not the same man who sold his daughter to cover gambling debts. And I'm certainly not the same woman who trembled on that auction block, as if to prove." Her point, young Tommy, one of the ranch hands, appeared at the study door. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Crawford, but Miller's boy took a bad fall from his horse. His ma's asking if you can come look at that arm of his." "Of course," Sarah replied, already reaching for her medical bag. "James, would you have Marcus? Send word to Dr. Jenkins." He finished with a smile. "Already done. Go on, I'll finish." With the ledgers, their easy coordination in such moments never failed to warm Sarah's heart. As she rode toward the Miller place, her mother's locket bouncing gently against her throat, she reflected on how much had changed. The frightened girl she'd been would never have imagined this life. Respected in her own right, studying medicine, helping run a successful ranch alongside a man who loved her completely. The injury proved to be a clean break, one Sarah could set confidently while they waited for Dr. Jenkins to arrive. As she worked, she told young Miller stories to distract him from the pain, tales of her own first riding lessons and falls. "You're a natural healer," Dr. Jenkins said later, examining her handiwork. "Just like your mother was a natural teacher from what I hear." Sarah smiled, remembering the stories James had collected from townspeople about Elizabeth Mitchell's days as the county's schoolteacher before her marriage. It meant everything that her mother's legacy lived on, in more than just memory. When She returned to the ranch that evening. She found James on their favorite porch swing, watching the sunset. He held out his arm and she settled beside him, fitting perfectly into the space, as if it had been crafted just for her. "I've been thinking," he said after a while, "about expanding the ranch's educational programs. Marcus mentioned some of the hens want to learn reading and figures. Thought maybe you could oversee it when you're not busy with your medical work." Sarah turned to study his face in the fading light. "You never stop finding ways for me to grow, do you? You do that all on your own," he replied, pulling her closer. "I just try to keep up." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge. From the bunkhouse came the sound of laughter and music. The hands often gathered to play cards and sing in the evenings. The smell of Mrs. Hanson's fresh bread drifted from the kitchen, mingling with the sweet scent of Mary's roses. "Do you ever wonder," Sarah asked softly, "what would have happened if you hadn't come to that auction?" James was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes. But then I remember something my father used to say. Some things in life look like accidents, but they're really God's way of getting us where we need to be." Sarah touched her mother's locket, then the simple gold ring on her finger. "Where we need to be," she repeated, thinking of all the twists and turns that had led them here. "Yes, I think you're right." The portrait above the fireplace would gain companions over the years, images of their growing ranch family, of Sarah in her doctor's coat, of James teaching the next generation of ranchers. But that first one would always hold a special place, capturing the moment when a marriage of convenience became a love story for the ages.